Welcome to a special program today. This is our Great Plains Black Heritage Charity, and we've been doing this for almost a year. Today's our last show in this series, and we have a special guest who is Adam Fletcher Sasse, who's appeared on previous programs discussing his books and articles on North Omaha African American history and culture. I initially became familiar with Adam when he wrote an excellent obituary on Matthew Stilly, a longtime community activist who was born in Hastings, Nebraska, a few months before me. And also, Matthew taught Black Studies in UNO and also worked with different people. But Adam wrote a wonderful obituary, and I was real impressed with about 10 pages. And that's how I got to know him. We connected after that, and so on. And one of the things that we have done in the past with this series, and of course with Adam being participating, is that Adam has written a book called hashtag Black Omaha, Black History, Omaha Black History, and it's an excellent book that talks about the great contributions of African Americans in Omaha and particularly North Omaha. He's a prolific writer, has hundreds of articles on his website as well. He's written over 4 or 5 books. And then the other shameless plug I'm going to make is there's another book we're going to talk about called Roots of Justice, of History of Race and Racism in Nebraska. Adam wrote a chapter with a number of people, and I think this book is an excellent book that we need to read about because, again, many of us as African Americans, people who grew up in North Omaha, understand the issue of racism. What's fascinating about this book is that it also includes other groups like Native American, Latinos, Asians, so on, as well as some of the challenges immigrants face in our community. And the way the format is today, what we do and what we've done is we normally start off with I will raise a series of questions to our guests to get us going. And then that second part, we'll stop and then we'll let our participants raise questions, comments, reactions. One thing I respect and like about Adam is he doesn't have a thin skin, so he's open to constructive criticism, improvements, and so on. So we've done that and done that in previous years. And one of the things I want to just give a shout out also is that this event is one of those events that hopefully as we continue to go forward, we can help increase the social capital amongst people of color as well as other people in our community and bring a great relationship of why the importance of history in our state, because oftentimes the things that we've contributed not only nationally but locally is not always shared in traditional media or institutions. So this is one of those things. But Adam, I want to start off to let you say just a little bit more about yourself because I didn't give much of an introduction, but let you say a little bit more about yourself and how where you're at and how you came about this, and then we'll start right into the questions.
Thank you, Ajamal. I appreciate that. My name is Adam Fletcher Sasse, and for the past 15 plus years, I've been researching and writing the history of North Omaha. I grew up at 27th and Ellison in the 80s and 90s, graduated from North in 93, the up, and all of that identity matters to me. It is who I am. Since I lived in Omaha, I moved away. I got out, is why we used to talk about it. And I've lived in New York City and Washington, D.C. I lived in Olympia, Washington for a long time outside of Seattle. But recently I have evacuated, let's call it a self-exile from the United States. I'm historically from Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen, and I had a green card to be in the States. And for let's say fear of retribution by ICE and the Trump administration, I left. And so right now, today, I'm joining you from the cold, barren, far north of Alberta, Canada, where it's -7 outside and there is 6 inches of snow. The snow stays from October to May. In addition to the articles and books that Ajamal talked about, I've given over 150 presentations related to the history of North Omaha. I've worked with a variety of partners. I stand on the shoulders of giants like Eric and the Great Plains Black History Museum. Thanks for having me here today, Eric, and of course, Ajamal and the rest of the team. But I've also partnered with the ADL, the Great Plains, with a variety of churches and congregations in North Omaha and other organizations and individuals who I stand indebted to, including Preston Love Jr., Terry Sanders, and other folks who are definitely part of the history and presence of the history in North Omaha today. I'm a goofy white guy. I'm a goofy white Canadian guy. And I am here as a guest of this history. I come as to educate white people. That's my job, is not to educate black people. It's not to teach black people about black history. If I coincidentally happen to do that, that's my honor, that's my privilege. But in reality, I'm just trying to help hard-headed people like myself understand a little bit better this place that we've called home, that is in our hearts, and that we owe a debt of gratitude to for the physical place as well as the people who make the community what it is. So I stand here today humbly and in gratitude. Thank you for having me, Ajamal.
Good. Well, my first question on raising, I think, is a question that's going to go to the book, The Roots of Justice, A History of Race and Racism in Nebraska. You literally, as we alluded to, has written hundreds of articles and books and so on dealing with African Americans and North Omaha. How does the Roots of Justice differ from your previous books or webpage article? And also, what was it like to collaborate with others on a chapter of that book?
It's really interesting. I again, I mean, it's like standing on the shoulders of giants. I look back and had to start at the literature by Bertha Callaway, who founded the museum, of course, and her book on African American history in Nebraska. I had to look back at the 1930s publication called A History of Negroes in Nebraska that was done by the Works Progress Administration. I had to look back into the newspapers. I had to look back into academic articles. I had to look across a whole variety of literature in order to really wrap my head around the bigness. And for a long time, 15 years of studying this history of Nebraska, the entire state, not just North Omaha, it really seemed like a puzzle. It was a bit of a mystery. Ms. Calloway really focused on cowboy history, and she loved that identity of black cowboys and everything that meant. And I started to find that, and then all this came out about DeWitty and all of the knowledge and power of the DeWitty community, which was an African American rural community up in Cherry County. And I started to see these pieces come together. Then I read the history of the Masons, the Black Masons, the Prince Hall Masons that was put out by the Nebraska Historical Society in the Nebraska History Magazine. And there are dozens of great articles that organization has put out, deep academic studies. And all of that began to really spark my imagination and make me think that there was something really big that was going on that was outside of North Omaha. And of course, I'd heard pushback from people who lived in South Omaha. Of course, I'd heard pushback from people who lived in other places. But when I started to piece it all together, Ajamal, I found this thing. So Preston Love Jr. comes to me and asks if I want to collaborate on this chapter. And eventually, what we ended up with is a team of 5 people, including Preston and myself, LeClaire Gilreath, Portia Love, and Heather Fryer. Heather really edited the whole thing and pulled it together. We submitted 70,000 words, and Heather brought it down to 40,000 to make it a little bit more fitting in line with the book. But it's still a really comprehensive story, and it's really great to read. Heather's editing really made it a very great read, and it's a different piece, definitely from the hashtag Omaha Black History book, because I focused on Omaha. I really drilled down on the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything in between about Omaha, and just really tried to lay it out: people, places, events, the whole thing. But in this Roots of Justice book, it's the entire state, and instead of telling the entire story, we really focused on that question of race and racism and what did that mean in the state. So it doesn't have the context of North Omaha specifically. I actually left a lot of that out because I already covered it. But what it does have is the context of the entire state, and it positions Black history in relationship to the entirety of Nebraska's history, which even Ms. Calloway's book didn't do back in the 80s. Instead, we really laid out how did this fit into the national picture? How did this fit into the territorial picture of Nebraska? How did it fit into the very local history of Nebraska? And painted out the whole state, rural, urban, the whole 9 yards, and where African Americans are throughout all of that history and presence today.
As you allude to that, and I'm calling audible here, I had an opportunity to interview a white guy who's a professor in Texas, and he wrote a wonderful article about the Exodus and what happened in Nebraska when many of the African Americans were getting out of enslavement and coming north and how they were rejected. And so there's a lot of articles and things out there that we don't necessarily see in some of our academic institutions that are written by folks who are in different places who have a fascination with Nebraska, and particularly African Americans. So I've interviewed him about that, but it's just a wonderful piece. And so one of the things that I emphasize to the participants is that we sometimes have to go to other places to find out what happened because at the time, many of us were not in a position to either write books and articles. And again, publishing companies didn't do that. So we have to go back and recreate our history through our ancestors, through our sense, or through our elders and people who are still alive to do that, and so on. The other question I have is from reading your book, Black History, hashtags Black History, why is that not shared more in Nebraska? I mean, again, we did the conference and we talked about different things, we had a lot of support from people. I had thought this would be much more utilized in our public schools, academic institutions, the universities, colleges, and so on. And again, we know there are some places that teach Black history. Metro has a class on and so on. And again, I'm wondering if they're using some of the stuff here, particularly as it accentuate or talks more about what local African Americans in Nebraska did, and particularly in North Omaha.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Ajamal, because the reality is I'm not an academic author. I don't come from the University of Nebraska Press or History Nebraska or any of these other Buffalo Press or any of these other institutions and organizations that exist solely to promote books and whatnot. Instead, I'm self-published on a lot of my history work. The Roots of Justice book is different because it did go through a regular publisher, but my own work, like hashtag Omaha Black History, was self-published. Now, the difference between me and a lot of historians then is that, well, they're busy doing their academic papers and building up their careers, but it's a whole publisher parish thing that they play by. I'm not doing that. That's not what I do. I'm also not making money off of this. This isn't about dollars and cents for me. This is a passion project to its core. So what you're seeing when you see hashtag Omaha Black History is one dude, one book trying to make a difference. I'm out there doing popular education because I really think that that's the real key. And the difference between me and those academic papers and the academic books, in the comments, Cynthia mentioned a great book by Jack Angus called Black and Catholic in Omaha, A Case of Double Jeopardy. And that is another great book. There are so many, actually, so many great books. In this book, in the Roots of Justice book, you'll find a great bibliography that kind of runs throughout the entire chapters. I use citations to back everything up. But then in the hashtag Omaha Black History book, Jack's book is in there. Dozens of others are. And if anybody wants a complete bibliography with literally more than 500 publications, you can check out northomahahistory.com and find that all about African Americans in Nebraska. But my point is, Ajamal, I do popular education. So I'm on social media, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, beating down the streets, trying to teach and tell and show people this isn't just big, fat, thick books. It's actually about a tile that says some information, some educational knowledge. It's about a picture, it's about an event, it's about a date, it's about something that is exciting and gripping, a factoid. Do you remember these kinds of things? I noticed that the museum lately is putting out more of these kinds of tiles to help engage the people who are reading social media. Because at one point, I have more than 200,000 people following me on Facebook and on social media for North Omaha's history. We had big clubs, we had different organizations. Now we got this Omaha History Club on Facebook, and that's just for the general public. It's a whole bunch of goofy white people. And there's a lot of racists and there's a lot of white supremacists, but there's also a lot of people who are just curious. They're black curious, let's call it. They want to know, where do black people fit into Omaha's history and Nebraska's history, and that's what I'm trying to educate and tell and show. So it's not just barking into the vacuum, as it were, but speaking through a megaphone and helping the world understand this is about the people and not about our own ignorance. And this is about blowing it up instead of just keeping it inside of little narrow academic shells.
As you alluded to that, one of the things that I liked about your book and also some other publications I ran into was the mention of Black fraternities, sororities, things that we didn't know about. Even when I've read David Bristow's book, Dirty Wicked Town, there were things I learned about the George Smith that I didn't know even as an academician teaching at UNO. We only know about Will Brown in the popular media, but I didn't know about there's some other obscure situations that were not publicized by our traditional media. So that's important. And then the other thing I was going to read to, again, as a reaction is I had a chance to interview Jack Angus before he passed. You probably about 25 years ago. I
Mm,
interviewed on KOS. They had me doing a show with public radio with the Omaha Public Schools. And I was fascinated by the way he wrote about how the Catholic Church in North Omaha started with Protestants helping the Catholics create a church, which was the first church in North Omaha. Because again, the Catholic Church being as apartheid segregated as it was, just like some of the Methodist Church and how they broke apart and had the Black Methodist Church, it's the same thing. Again, you only discover this history by someone who's doing it. And again, oftentimes some of these narratives, as you and I all know, that if they don't present a positive life on the traditional, the Trumpites or those kind of personalities, they're not going to print it or else they're going to try to whitewash it. So you have to go and find these little gleams of nuggets of gold in different places, or as we would say, pearls of wisdom to get that. So it is fascinating how the church in North Omaha, particularly St. Benedict the Moor, got started through Protestants and they were not even Catholics. So they value the importance of religion and helping other people to get it to their religious salvation and so on. I'm going to switch up again and ask you a different kind of a question. And it's kind of a little bit of history of what we did together was that conference we had in October 2025 last year, where you were the keynote speaker, the presenter, the main person, the focus. And I have not really deconstructed that whole event. I do have to write a report for some of the funding sources and so on. What was your honest reactions about that presentation and your engagement with that group? Again, you and I have not talked about all the nuances and the
that's right.
feedback. And I do know you had Meanie Crawford Gray, who was very critical and had some
That's
constructive
right.
feedback. You took it again. I know a lot of people raised stuff about who's this goofy white guy writing about Black history. should we
That's
be
right.
doing our own stuff? But let us know what you thought about that event, because I think it was something that was supported by a number of major entities in our community. But like I say, I want you to be as honest as you can to just say what you need to say about your reaction to that event.
First and foremost, Ajman, and I can't say this to you enough. I mean, thank you for giving me that platform because the reality is I'm not getting let into a lot of places. You know, the Omaha Public
All right,
Schools
hold
is a
on.
great.
Why are you not getting laid into places? That's the question I'm throwing out a little bit too.
So I'm gonna let you hold on to that question. Let's parking lot that, and I'll talk about
Okay.
the conference first.
Okay.
These organizations have these events, they bring in the speakers, they have the talks, and they're all people who are okay to have through the door. The reality is, I make white people uncomfortable because I'll talk about white supremacy. I'll talk about my own racist tendencies. I'll talk about our ignorance as white people and what that means. I also make black people uncomfortable sometimes because I'm so transparent about that. You know, there is no illusion that I have about my own ignorance. There's a lot of it, and I don't flaunt it. It's an ugly thing, but I'm trying to work with it. And I will say that to any group, anytime, anywhere, for any purpose. And the reality is that's where I step from. I also step from the reality that I grew up in North Omaha. I'm not a tourist to this. This is not some kind of holiday or vacation to me. This is the reality of walking down Ellison Street in 1991 and getting jumped for being the goofy white guy. You know, this is reality. Right? I mean, this is just how I live. This is where I come from. This is who I am. And I bring that unabashedly wherever I go, particularly in this conversation. So to be invited into that room that day with those folks, Jamal, I can't be grateful enough to you for that opportunity. That said, the thing that I would say and that I've said to you before and that I will repeat to anybody who will listen is that Black history needs to be in the hands of Black people. And the less that I get invited, the less that I need to be in a room, the better off we all are, especially white people. I will not stop advocating to white people to stop our ignorance. That's my job. That's what I do. But I think that importance of really shining a light on African American history and bringing that out for all that it is, that's something that's a mantle that's got to be picked up in the community. And that's what I saw in that event was the reality that people want to pick up the mantle, they want to do that advocacy, but they need the opportunities to learn and to grow and to really get into it. We need to stop asking people to volunteer. I come to this from a place of privilege, and let me tell you, it's a thin sliver of privilege sometimes. I ain't got no money for this. You know, this is just another great opportunity for me to share my knowledge, but people need to get paid to do this advocacy. They need to advocate for Black history for pay. They need to teach it for pay. They need to, you know, there needs to be opportunities for the community to learn from the community by people who are in the community in that deep and personal way. But those people got to get paid because we live in a capitalist society that doesn't honor it otherwise. And I actually think that's another reason why I don't get invited into rooms because I don't charge. And people don't see it as legitimate if you ain't charging. So all of that said, Ajamal, what I saw that day is that need for the Black community to really take on Black history and build it out in its own way, in its own shape that doesn't look like this guy. And I welcome any project, any partnership, any ability that I have to pass on what I have, and in order to really grow it and seed it there. And that's really what that event was all about for me. Thank you.
You know, one thing I'm going to add to that, and I think it's part of this conversation, is that I just got through reading a book. I'm in the process of one third in a book, and one of the things I like to emphasize is the top 10 books that influenced my life are books that are notable that we should all read before we move to the spirit world. But there's a book called The End of Blackness, and it talks to the woman's name is Deborah Dickerson, and she's a fascinating read because what she does is she critiques our history, but she also comes from a person who has a law degree who doesn't practice law, went to Harvard University. But she has this way of admonishing racism, but she also admonishes African Americans who don't get involved in the struggle for advancement. As you know, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and some of these great icons, you name them, women who are not always reflected in our history. She talks very succinctly about why we need to reclaim, Adam, our history, and we need to get our people more involved and exposed to this stuff. And so one of the things I throw out to you is that there's so many nuggets out there. And again, you have to search for something because it's not going to get the kind of fanfare and the kind of things that hit the New York Times bestsellers list. But as you all know, we all know there are a lot of great heroes in our community. They just do their work every day. They take care of their families. They feed their families. They do what they got to do. And they don't always they look for a lot of accolades and this and that. So very important for us to continue to know that because if we know our history, then we're not going to sit there and play ignoramuses and not be able to do something to make our future go forward. Eric, you got something to say here?
Yeah, I got a quick. I was listening to what Adam was saying, and I agree with you, but it's also kind of a reversal on that. When you have an African American telling those stories about African Americans, There's some groups that are less likely to believe our word in
That's
those
right.
stories.
That's right.
And then, but yet, if it comes from you, then it must be true. And so it kind of goes back and forth where, if you speak about our history, you legitimize it. If I speak about our history, then it's like, well, you're speaking from an emotional perspective and you haven't really done the scholarly work to support your comments on the subject matter.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's right, Eric, and I appreciate you saying that. Thank you for checking me on that. It is a two-way street for sure. Cynthia said a really interesting thing in the comments as well. She said Nick Bailey's My Omaha documentary that just came out is, in my opinion, for white education. Where does this fit into your effort to shed light on Black contribution, especially in Nebraska? I think it's important for me to say, in addition to your point, Eric, there have been other white people for a long time who've tried to do different elements of this. One of the greatest books in Omaha's race canon, as it were, the literature that really supports this, came out in the 1970s, and it was by Lois Staley, and it was called, I'm not going to remember the name of it. Anyway, it was all about this white woman's experience of moving into North Omaha and what that was like. I will look up the name of that book before we're done, and I'll say it. But another piece that fits into there is A Time for Burning, and really that documentary that had Ernie Chambers in it from back in the late 60s, and that whole question of Augustana Lutheran Church, where they tried to do this piece. That was a white filmmaker who made that. That's now in the Library of Congress. So, I mean, you got all these different elements, nice, well-meaning white people, let's call us, who are trying to do this work. And they can support the work better and more effectively. And Eric, that is something I strive to do in every way. That's part of my partnership here with Ajamal and with you and the different things that we can do. But it's always this question, no matter who it is, how it is, where it is, how do we permeate more effectively? How do we bring it together more effectively? I get a hit every single time that the Durham Museum puts out anything related to Black history. It's never been about Black history in Omaha, but they are trying, according to them. I get a hit anytime that the Douglas County Historical Society puts out anything about Black history. It's never been enough, but they at least have tried historically. There are these attempts. So it's this question of how can we work together with these white allies, but also within the community itself and leverage the two of those against each other. There's a great movement happening inside of the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation right now, where they want to step up to this history and really bring to light the history of empowering Black people in Omaha and what that means. And so it's really how do we work together in all these different streams and all these different pathways to bring this story to light in a more effective way. And Jamal, that gets back to your point from the very beginning. How do we raise the boat? Because the rising tide lifts all boats.
Right. And Eric, to your point, I'm going to raise a different angle. Again, one of the things that we have done in our events and we do is we sometimes raise contrary or different points of view to raise the bar up. In other words, some people say steel sharpens steel. Those of us who lived in Africa, we say diamonds sharpen diamonds. But one example I'll use is that years ago I had the opportunity to interact with Patrick Jones, who's considered one of the great historians in Lincoln. And he's a white guy who did some stuff related to Milwaukee in his dissertation. Again, I've interacted with him. And we had a deep conversation one day. Again, we don't always see eye to eye. And I asked him a question as a white historian or white scholar, whatever, how many Black folks do you invite as guest speakers to your class? And he basically said to me, I invite who I want to invite and so on. And I'm like, man, that's arrogant. It's stupid. It's asinine. It's like me teaching women's culture and never inviting a woman to my class. And again, I whooped him and slapped him. He had nothing to do with me. And again, I'm going to call those kind of people imposters. You do not appropriate people's culture and history. And that's one thing I appreciate about Adam. Amy Forrest wrote a wonderful dissertation about Mildred Brown, the Omaha Star, and she teaches at Metro. I've not seen any great African Americans from our communities, historians, whatever, participate in her class. Again, I'm not throwing shade at on one side. I'm just saying you don't go and appropriate people's culture and history and never go in their communities. Again, that was the criticism I'll bring related to advocacy. Part of the problem we face is we have to inculcate our community and our families with their own history. Some of us don't have the academic ability or skill set on how to do research. And again, it's very important to say you don't have to go through college and university to do it. But we got to be careful that when we get these gatekeepers, and sometime going back to the concept you raised, Eric, of white folks being the promoter of our culture and history, we need to call them out when they don't have a relationship or they have never set foot in our community. And again, yes, there are white supremacists and racist people who will only hear from their own kind. But again, some of those folks we have to ignore. And I'm trying to argue the point as we do collectively is how do we collectively help our own people to walk into the cesspool of stupidity and do some of the stuff we do? Because you and I both know that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, their journey, so Journey, Truth, Harriet Tubman, you name it, all the great people in our community did it out of love. So again, we can come with different points of view. Let's keep going forward and make sure we have outcomes from what we do.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
I'm
like I always say, some people they look to cash in, or some people look to pimp our miseries.
That expression is a squeeze worth the juice. How do we make sure that when our kids graduate, they have enough self assurance or self esteem or what you call self confidence? They continue that self exploration because we all know as folks who set foot in the academic institutions, ivory towers, and so on, they're not always supporting us. And some of that stuff we have to unlearn, or we have to go, as Malcolm would say, we have to go and learn it on our own, like he did when he was in prison. And some of us shouldn't have to go to prison to learn about the culture and so on. I want to switch up just a little bit. I want to ask, and I'll use the word switch up because I want to just throw this kind of random thing. Many people of color have never met an historian of someone who writes from their perspective, okay? And what advice would you give to lay historians in North Omaha sharing their personal family history? And I do know that UNO has an archivist and people who work on that. The Omaha Public Libraries has archivists, and they're trying to get our community more involved in doing family history and doing that lay history that's so important and things that we didn't know. In other words, like I said, I was so fascinated when I found out all the great things Nebraskans have done in Omaha and even the state that I didn't know that they were of my complexion and even Native people and Asians and also Latinos. And I'm like, wow. And again, it's not recorded unless you do a serious search. So my question to you is, what advice would you give or say to people to get jazzed up or zealous about history and why it's important for us to continue this great journey?
One of the new spectacular resources that's available is the North Omaha Visitor Center. That just opened up down the street from Eric, and there's a beautiful timeline on the wall there now with 100 points of Black history in Omaha. I helped them put that piece together, and what we did was really name out people, places, and events from the community that really matter, that really draw out some of that. And what people will find when we look into the history, I just put a link here into the chat to directly to my bibliography that I mentioned, 500 different sources. When you look at these articles, when you look at these places, when you look at these events, you see your own history, you see yourself. And this is the whole thing about the Black history question in Omaha. When you look in a mirror and don't see yourself, what does that do to your sense of self? And what we're doing is holding up the mirror with reality and saying Black people aren't just in Omaha right now. They haven't just been there for the last 50 years. Black people have been in Omaha since before the city was founded. And so by holding that mirror up, people can start to see, wait a second, that's my grandma's name. That's my family's old church where my great grandparents got married. That's the fraternal organization that my dad talked about. And all these other identities and questions. That's the loose thread that I pull on. This is where I got 800 different topics that I have written individually about because every one is another thread into the community. And it's a big woven blanket, Ajamal. And from my privilege and ignorance as a white person, I look at that blanket and I see African Americans woven so tightly, and I see white people, and I see Native Americans, and I see other people of color, and I see poor people, and I see rich people, and all of that history is one tapestry. It's funky. It's not a pretty picture, but if you pull on one thread of it, you find your mom's mom's mom. Or you find African Americans who were running for political office in 1879. Or you find the incident in the 1860s where a group of 400 white dudes tried to stop 20 African American men from voting in Omaha in 1860s. This voter suppression, this police brutality, this hospital segregation, the school segregation, all of these questions, they aren't new to the city. And you pull on any one of these threads and you find out how you're connected to those threads and how they connect to you. So if you want a place to start, you jump on those social media tiles, you go to the museum, you go to the visitor center, you go to these different places and you find yourself and you see yourself in that mirror for the first time. Where white people have very systematically erased Black people from the picture, we're trying to bring it back. We're trying to show it back and say, hey, Black people aren't just here, but they've been here since back in the day, and they'll continue to be here for the rest of time. And we're going to blow that up and make it bigger and bigger, and that's the way that people get excited about it.
One thing that one of the things in many academic institutions, there are schools of people with certain expertise or schools of thought in history. What areas outside of your interest that you wish others would focus on? Again, obviously you don't have the time or you don't have the interest or whatever, but what are some of those important areas, Adam, some of those areas, things we should deal with? And again, Eric, you may want to contribute to this question too, but what are some of those unmet needs that we have in our community as we talk about history and helping our people to focus on things that can help augment, or at least I say, make us a better group or better people?
Eric's called me out about this, and I want to be very blunt about that because his take is proper. The reality is, I paint at a 10,000 foot level, at a 20,000 foot level. I'm way up here in the clouds, and I'm just giving a little introduction to this person, a little introduction to that date. I can write a 1,500 word essay on the history of Native Omaha days. That doesn't make it the history. I can write a 5,000 word biography on Edwin Overall and the spectacular things he did in Omaha history. That doesn't make it his life story. The reality is we need people who can do deep dives, who can get in, not just find the family history, but also find the institutional history, organizational history, the event history, and contextualize it all. And that's one of the great advantages of the museum. Eric, your collection is phenomenal for helping people understand the context that all this came from and really get into those depths. And to your point about oral history and really those family histories, Ajamal, that's what they can do is bring out the depth and plumb the meaning and really get to the story instead of just this superficial kind of vague stuff that's out there the way that I do. Eric, please correct me. Anything that I'm missing in that?
No, I think you're accurate with that, and I think getting our younger folks to understand that that they can, that we have these resources in the community for them to learn about the greatness of us. As I when I work with young kids, young folks when they come into the museum, I always say I want them to they come in walking a certain way, and I want them leaving walking a different way, having a different swag about themselves, realizing not just the negative things that they've heard, but the great things that and the contributions that we've done from a local perspective. A lot of the exhibits that we create uh, are exhibits relating to the macro are big things that have occurred throughout America, but then I also try to tie in, Omaha and what we were doing during that particular time. Next month we'll have our the Green Book. We'll be focusing on the conversation on the Green Book from a local perspective, talking about the 30 plus different locations that were Green Book destinations or safe haven places during that particular time in history. So when a lot of times, that you hear about it and it's like, okay, oh, the Green Book, and this was happening throughout America. And like nothing was happening in Omaha. But I like to then try to tie that story, what was happening in Omaha, what was happening in Nebraska, what was happening throughout the Great Plains during those things, during those more larger events.
Good. We're going to be switching up in a little bit and going out to the other participants that engage with us. But I wanted to ask, History Nebraska has some excellent articles, and I got to know David Bress a little bit years ago when we talked about the memorial event we did with the lynching of Will Brown and just things like that. Will sometimes confuse Will Brown, Will Smith there, but talk about that. And the other issue that we talked about is there's some stuff in our state historical archives that we should be seeing and knowing. I didn't know there was a lot of articles done by I want to say esoteric scholars or people that are out there, but we don't know about them because they're oftentimes not shared in our institution. My question to you, Adam, is how have you utilized those articles contrast to what you use to a great deal with reference source or newspapers? In other words, how connected are you to the state historical societies? There's two of them down there that has information about history in Nebraska.
Yeah, so the responsibility, I mean, does fall on my shoulders with respect to finding and identifying those resources. One of the things that the Historical Society has done in the past is made it difficult to access a lot of their online archives. The Durham Museum was generous for a long time about having their digital photos online and a beautiful archive of those. And I use those extensively to identify and really plumb out some of these historical photos. I know that in time the Great Plains Black History Museum will raise up their collection so that we can see those digitally. But the Nebraska Historical Society has done a better, and increasingly better job of getting that so it's publicly available. Um, I did use a lot of their materials in writing the chapter, the history of African Americans in Nebraska for Race and Racism for the Roots of Justice book, and they have beautiful, beautiful articles. Like we said, I mean, now the part of the challenge with it all, Jamal, is that they're all academic. They all have that scholarship. They all have that real foundation in citing their sources and doing those different components that build on the history, that build on the science of history, and that's beautiful. I love that, and I have a lot of respect for it. But because of that format, as it were, they're inaccessible to a lot of people. People don't want to read that stuff. And so it's a question of how do we ferret through those materials to really find the gold, to really find the nuggets and shine a light on them. And that's one of the really powerful pieces about what the Great Plains Black History Museum can and does do is make the ephemera, the stuff, the physical things visible and interactable with the people who come to visit. And they can really lift that up. And I think that's what the Nebraska State Historical Society can do better. Make a traveling exhibit, bring the Historical Society to North Omaha and interact with the museum, with the Great Plains Black History Museum more so that we can really shine a light on that ephemera and let people taste, touch, and smell the things that they only read about in history, the things that they only heard from their grandmama around the Thanksgiving dinner table, the things that just make it real in that way, make it tangible so that people can really taste, touch, and smell what history is like.
Right. By the way, I'm calling audible here. I was born in Hastings, Nebraska, but grew
That's
up in
right.
Omaha.
That's right.
And one of the things that I don't think we do a great job is talk about blacks who lived in the state, how they arrived, whether it be these small towns where they were coming out of the enslavement period and so on in the 1850s and 60s, and then how they ended up migrating to Omaha or Lincoln because there were better opportunities. They had to deal with some real redneck negative stuff in rural communities. And the reason I share that is that before I was born, I had no clue what black fraternities and sororities did to help each other. In other words, there's that great sense of doing a lot of that entrepreneurship as well as helping self-help with these organizations because we didn't have a lot of those organizations doing things for us. And again, some of us will argue we should have that same thing happening today. Case in point, I read about the black fraternity and sororities. I've never been a great supporter going through college, but then as I start to read about them, and my son's a member of one of the fraternities, I know the stuff they do through his interpretation. So, Adam, my question, or even to you, Eric, is I would love to see a little bit more history about self-help groups talk about that because again, if you don't know about it, you think we just started Black Lives Matters or we started, the YWC and the YMCA recently to help us. But there was a lot of groups and people in rural Nebraska, in Omaha and whatever, that was members of clubs and Batil, you name it, that did good stuff of self-help. And I'd love to see a lot more of that. But my question basically is how can we bring more of that to our table, their history, and then maybe get more people to see the value and importance of it, and particularly those who are like me are very critical of them and may not see the importance of them today or whatever.
So I think it's
Interesting.
important. Oh, go ahead, Eric. Sorry.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I believe it's a little over 2 years ago. We actually had an exhibit. It was a 9-month exhibit called the D9, which focused on the 9 African American fraternities and sororities, and it talked about founders and the work and things in which they do have done in the community and continue to do in the community. I'll do a shameless plug. I am myself a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, the alumni chapter here in Omaha, and we're always in that helping mode or that service mode where we're helping others and providing them opportunities to be better.
Okay, good, good,
So,
good.
so to build on that, Ajmal, I think it's important also to contextualize all of that work in the light of this larger question of empowerment. One of the texts, Ajmal, I just finished and sent over to Ajmal is a new book on the history of the civil rights movement in Omaha. And really painting out all the ways that individuals and organizations have fought with and against the government and other forces of white supremacy to battle racism in Nebraska. And so that book is really meant to highlight those battles, those efforts, those constructs, and to really show and juxtapose. Nebraska media has historically been very negative about Black people. I don't need to
It's
tell
true.
you all that.
That's true.
And the reality is, those images are one-sided. They are racist to their core because they only portray African Americans either as violent super criminals or as passive recipients of crime. And in reality, what we know is that Black people have been working against white supremacy as well as white-driven crime, white-driven economic injustice, and on for more than 175 years in the state's history. And now we've got a draft of this publication that's going to go out to the world and tell them that. So, Ajamal, that's another step that we can take in the direction that you're asking. I just want to bring out really quick in the chat. Shayna asked a question. How do you handle conflicting evidence or interpretations when you're researching and writing? And what's your greatest achievement since doing this work? I'm going to weave this into answering your question, Ajamal. So in doing the research on the history of fighting racism in Nebraska by African Americans, for African Americans and other people of color, there's all kinds of conflicting information because the general white narrative is one of disempowering Black people, either through, again, painting them as being passive subjects of white supremacy or as being indifferent to the struggle that they're part of, and if anything, perpetuating quote unquote Black on Black crime and this kind of shenanigans. In reality, I'm trying to tell this different story. So, Shana, the way that I address that is by smashing them together, highlighting white supremacy when I have to, and really showing the way that Black power not only resists white supremacy, but actually dismantles it. And the way that African Americans have been working against these forces for 175 years in the state's history. So really showing compare and contrast and not just erasing one, but lifting it up, because that white supremacy needs to be shined a light on, and people need to understand that's been the MO in the state for all of this time. The greatest achievement that I've had since doing this work, honestly, and I don't say this to fluff anybody's feathers, but it's to be real, I have the honor today to sit in this conversation with Jamal and Eric. And the fact of the matter is, we're looking at two of the city's main leaders for African American history, for African American empowerment, and really bringing that out. And to be even considered a player at that table, a person who can join in the conversation, is an honor and a privilege to me that I don't get matched any other way. I haven't gotten any awards for anything that I've done. I've volunteered 15 years and done thousands of hours of research and written millions of words about Black history, about North Omaha history, and nobody's shined a light on that. And that's okay, because I get to be at this table, and that's what matters to me. That's my greatest achievement since starting this work.
By the way, we're going to open it up because we're halfway through, and again, we want to give people a chance to talk directly to you, Adam, or raise a question, or do what Eric and I have been doing. But before we do that, 2 quick points. Number one, I'm always amazed how we don't have institutional buy-in from our educational structure. In other words, as a kid who went through the public schools, I didn't know a lot about Black folks through my textbooks. I knew we have Nebraska history at the elementary level, and I even took under Mary Dean Harvey Black history at Central High School. And again, there was stuff I never learned about local people. I learned about national stuff, but I didn't know learn about local people, whatever, in those classes, and even as I got to the university and so on. And so my point, or the question I'm going to raise, is what can we do as avid lovers or historians of sorts of different levels to get our institutions to do a better job to promulgate through our taxpayer systems that we support through our property tax and elsewhere, our own culture and history. Because again, I know that the Jewish people have some great input into getting Jewish and Holocaust history in schools. And actual fact, they even have certification programs where they get teachers to teach the correct manner from their perspective. But even though we make up a higher percentage in the school system, we don't have that. So my point is, how can we get institutions like public schools or private schools to propagate our culture and history in the context of an academic system from your vantage point?
Honestly, I haven't cracked that golden nut or whatever it is. I haven't figured out. Eric, how are you doing with all that?
Jamal, as you and I, we've had conversations. We know that that's not happening. And so sometimes you have to take and say, okay, if you're not going to do it, we need to do it. And so what the Great Plains Black History Museum has done just this last year, and then going into 2026, we've hosted once a month our Black Heritage Saturday events, where we've had various speakers come in and talk about various things as it pertains to Black history. We're putting together our package for 2026 at this time, and we're working with a few other organizations. We're working with Identity Prep Academy, Omaha Cares Mentoring Movement, the 100 Black Men of Omaha, and Church on Purpose. And we are, going to be offering from elementary, middle, high school, and youth to adults and elders presentations similar to this, but in person at the Learning Community Center in North Omaha at 1612 North 24th Street. We'll kick off this year with the history of of U.S. discussion on Black history. That'll be the 28th of February. Each month, we'll be hosting those events. It'll be the the fourth Saturday of each month. And it'll be from 11, just as today, 11 to 12:30. And we'll have various facilitators coming and talking about those particular things. We'll have it broken down into four different classes. Uh, for one for our elementary youth, one for our middle school, high school, and then adults and elderly. So then that way the conversation will be similar, but it'll be at the level of that particular group in which we'll be working with. So we'll have four different facilitators uh, working with folks on those particular subjects. This came from the Great Plains Black History Museum. We did something like this before the pandemic, and after the pandemic happened, we hadn't done it much, and I decided to start doing it again last year because also I was down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and attended one of their events. They have what it's called Black History Saturday, and because I didn't want to infringe upon their title, we called it Black Heritage Saturday, and so it'll be covering those particular topics. In March, we'll talk about the history of voting and Black suffrage. April, we'll talk about Black Wall Street, the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In May, we'll talk about HBCUs and Brown versus Board of Education. And in June, we'll talk about Juneteenth, the history and celebration. And those are be available and open to the public. And refreshments will be provided for those in attendance.
By the way, Eric, just one thing of clarification is that as you get towards the end of the year, I know you talked about just the first part of the year, but they will not probably be the fourth Saturday when you get to around Thanksgiving or maybe Christmas time or Kwanzaa, because again, there may be some altering of those dates to move it earlier. But again, I know the committee or the folks who's working at it haven't determined those dates. And again, what you just alluded to was the beginning part of the year, but at the end of the year, we want to be careful not to say the fourth Saturday of December when people are on holidays and people are with their loved ones. And so that's just more of a clarification.
Yeah, November and December will have alternate Saturdays to replace those, and this will we hope will we expect it to give allow a different perspective of our history, and put us driving our vehicle versus being the passenger of our vehicle, and then also being a resource for the community.
Good,
One,
good.
one of the really powerful things that I think the museum has done under your leadership, Eric, is really draw the thread together that weaves national history, national Black history, and Omaha Black history and Nebraska Black history, and really weaves them all together so that people can understand these aren't just far away remote events. One of the things that white people are tempted to do, even in well-meaning Omaha, even in the blue dot, is to look at segregation and say, oh, that happened in the South, to look at enslavement and say, oh, that was a phenomenon in the South, to even look at civil rights movement and say, oh, that might have happened in Chicago, that might have happened in DC and in the South. But they don't understand that all of that was present and forthright in Omaha as much as anything. I'm going to bring a big circle right here because Cynthia asks any points from you on early boycott efforts during segregation days. And then she talks about Matt Holland and Father John Marco and the DePores Club and these kinds of pieces. And all of that is powerful, Cynthia, and very relevant to the conversation. But again, one of the things that we have to do when we weave this blanket is look at not just breadth in terms of Omaha and the context of national and what was going on, but also longevity. And the reality is of the civil rights movement in Omaha, I have traced it to begin in 1867. That's 2 years after the Civil War ended. The civil rights movement was beginning in Omaha when an African American man arrived in the city who was a former Underground Railroad conductor. And he said, why does this city have segregated schools? They had a Black school that Omaha Public Schools doesn't mention, by the way, but it was an Omaha Public School that was called the Omaha, quote, Colored School. And it was down in the Black neighborhood at 12th and Dodge. And they made Black students go to the school so they didn't go to the neighborhood schools with the white kids. And this guy shows up, Edwin Overall, and he says, why is this so? And he spent 3 years lobbying the school board to stop that segregated school. And in 1871, Omaha Public Schools rescinded the Nebraska territorial uh, charter became the state constitution, and it did not allow those schools to exist anymore. And that's because of the advocacy of a black civil rights pioneer in Omaha in 1867. So all of this history is so much thicker, richer, and deeper than we acknowledge. And we have to understand that, Eric, what you're doing at the museum is weaving together all of those different threads of history. But Cynthia, we have to understand that that civil rights history is part of that, and that it's much bigger and thicker than we've ever estimated or thought of before.
Gotcha, gotcha. Other feedback, other reaction. You can talk directly to the guests, and as we've got Eric being the co-host here, so other feedback, other things. Eric, just a quick question for you, and I guess it goes back to what you have in mind. If you had a magic wand, or you do have a magic wand, what is your hope for this whole series as you move forward? And maybe that's a question also for you, Adam, and in terms of, you alluded to it a little bit earlier, but what are we trying to accomplish in terms of what we do? And again, that cliche goes, if you know, when you start out on the journey, you got to know where you're going to get there. And so the roadmap, what is it you want to see happen in the ideal situation, or even I say a pragmatic situation, looking at the backward start we've had on dealing with this topic in our red state?
To be an educational resource for our community and for anyone that wants to learn the history, and to again, as I said earlier, maybe give some of our young people a new swag, a different swag. Once they learn about the great things we've done, and get beyond the propaganda about Black people. Hopefully putting them in a better place. Because if they say, when you feel good, you do good.
Right.
So if the more people I can put in a better place to feel good, I know that they'll do good, and I know with them doing good, there'll be a bigger benefit to the community.
One of the things I like to share is, as a young man, and I remember my mother with all 14 of us, and it was 14 of the house, and the first wave of us, she used to send us to the store across the street and elsewhere, and she says, "I'm going to pray you there, and if you go outside that thing, something could happen to you." And I don't know what happened, but I can tell you I had fear. So I would go to the store with my little note, get the stuff, come back, and I didn't go outside that beaten path because she put some fear in me. Only she feared me because she would whoop my butt, but secondly, she had me scared that I could have an accident. I didn't have an accident, like a car hitting me crossing that busy street over on Paul Street area. But my point back to y'all in saying that is that when you know your history and you have guidance where you want to go, you're a lot more better off to get there than if you just wander around meandering and doing the kind of stuff we do. As I look at some of our young people and people who are older, you name it, we sometimes don't know the value of who we are and how important we are, and we don't have that guidance from our ancestors or our parents or elders, uncles, aunts, you name it, to help us stay on that beaten path. And again, it reminds me, my kid was in school and he had a Bushman piano, Bassaro piano, and show and tell him, the teacher tried to tell him it was a mousetrap. He says, "No, that's not that. This is from Africa." He held his ground, and that white teacher who was unfamiliar with African artifacts or things didn't know that. And so the same way with what we're talking about today, the more you know about who you are and where you come from, someone can uproot you and do the kind of stuff of whitewash your culture and history. And that goes for any group. I don't care where you come from, but if you know where you're about and a little bit of background, people can't reinvent you and talk only about the negativity as if you're not important as a species or a person, because we have all contributed some great things to our society. And too often, some of us may want to emphasize only the myopic, neo, saying the, I want to use the word, kind of a self-serving kind of perspective instead of dealing with the group thing. In other words, we say the I and the me versus the we and the us. And the word I'm really thinking narcissist is the word I want to say. Narcissistic history, as if other groups didn't do anything to make this society great. So I just want to throw that out there. Other feedback, other reactions, other people.
Osmo, when you know who you are, nobody can tell you anything different.
That
You
man
know,
is
one
go ahead, go ahead.
one of the things that I think is really relevant to that, though, and this is the thing that I like to bring back around, is that this notion of painting an American Black history is, again, a beautiful tapestry, and it really, really shows the depth and breadth and meaning of it all. But I think it's equally as important to highlight this Omaha Black history very specifically, so the African American young people in Omaha have that identity of the city. There is a real brain drain, and you all know this better than me, that real brain drain of young people leaving Omaha because of its racist tendencies. Just because there's the election of an African American mayor, which is beautiful and wonderful and a good thing and long overdue, doesn't mean that African American youth are going to stay in the city. But if they know, if they can look in that mirror and see the reality that black people aren't just here right now, but have been here through time doing powerful things, that's going to keep them there and do all the things that you're talking about, Eric. Do that reinforcement, do that empowerment, do that belonging, and all of the things that we want young black people to experience today, as well as young white people who get to grow up in the reality that black people aren't just some kind of a national big figureheady thing. It's not all Martin Luther King Jr. and even ML or even Malcolm X. It's actually about lots of people in lots of places doing lots of things, including Omaha, Nebraska. So we really got to highlight that whole picture instead of just that national picture. And I know you both get that better than I can say it.
By the way, there's some participants here, and I see there's about 10 people or 8 people, whatever, on there. Other comments, feedback. We don't want this to be the Trinity conversation between the three of us, but other feedback, challenge us, push back, whatever. Questions.
Drop your questions in the chat. You can unmute yourself and speak out loud, whatever you want.
By the way, one thing just, let me hesitate so people can come in. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. But one thing that just hit me as you were talking is, and I'm reminded of Dr. Donna Pope. I'm reminded of who deals with a lot with Native Americans. I spent 6 years on the board of the Latino Center in the Midlands. Back then it was called Chicano Awareness Center. I've met many Asians in our community. And so often we talk about Black folks in our struggle. What is fascinating, there are other groups in our society. And one of the challenges we face in Nebraska is systems do not always help us to come together. And I would love to see, and again, in this book, The Roots of Racism, there are some other chapters in here that we can learn about their struggles and how they're parallel. Because again, when the boogeyman is getting after us, it's not by ourselves. And what's that metaphor? If the bear is chasing us, I just want them to catch the one behind me so they won't get me. And so one of the things I don't want us to ever ignore is that the struggle that we face, it has been inflicted upon other groups uh, of color, that is, that we're talking about, and even poorer folks in general. But we need to also acknowledge the other contributions as we start to deal with our own self. And I don't want to be myopic about that. So I always like to throw out, how do we think about the Native Americans and the Asians and Latinos in our community? Because again, I can count on one hand the people that I know who are conveners of groups from other groups. And there's not a lot of those in our community. And I want to just throw that out, that we just don't have a lot of that.
So there's a question from your son in the comments, Ajamon. He asks to tell us about your next North Omaha project. You've authored plenty of books and articles. What's next? And then says you've been on the local scene for quite a while. Do you have any intention of taking your work national? New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN, and the likes. So just to answer both of those, my NorthOmahaHistory.com project will continue the way that it is. I struggle with AI is gobbling up my content. Eric knows I have been really good about taking content from other people. And really shining a light on it. I've been trying to for the extent of my history project, I've been trying to generate new content, draw topics that aren't out there in the public, and really shine a light on them, bring them out, and let the community know about different people, different places, different events. But also, I found a need to really highlight the things that people already talk about Native Omaha days, but I still need to write a history about it. People already talk about the museum, but I wanted to write a history of the old building, the Webster Telephone Exchange building, and its role in the community. People already talk about these different things, but I needed to highlight those different kinds of things. So I will continue to keep going those depths, but I'm trying to figure out how can I work with AI in a way that doesn't allow it to gobble up my content? And not that it's all about intellectual property. It's just about, who does knowledge belong to? I think Black history, especially in Omaha, belongs to African American people. It doesn't belong to me. I just happen to be the one to write it. I want to share it through institutions like the museum, through institutions like Moore, through institutions that want to bring it out and shine a light on it. And it doesn't have to be about my name, it's about the community. But I don't want it to go out through AI, like AI owned it, like AI found it, like AI blew it up. Because I spent a lot of work and energy and time trying to do that, trying to get that exposure out there. So that's thing one, is to really reinforce the role of NorthOmahaHistory.com, really reinforce that social medias, and it's continuing at this point rather than trying to blow it up or do something next, which goes to that second point of being on the local scene. I don't really have an interest. I have an interest, but I don't think it's my role to bring this work national for Omaha's sake. in terms of, these big media outlets and whatnot. I think that somebody in the community can do that a lot more effectively than me, whether that's Ajamal, whether that's Eric, whether that is a young person who is coming up in the struggle right now, whether that is a young politician who wants to shine a light. Ernie Chambers, when he was a young man in the 1960s, was talking about bringing Black history in Omaha public schools. So this is the kind of figure that we need within the community today. Not a new Ernie, but a new person to stand up and advocate for this from within the community, for the community in this larger sense. So I haven't really thought about where that goes next. Yeah. Nomi asked a question that I think would be better for Ajamal and Eric to really bring out here in the chat. Have you thought about writing or building a class about Omaha history for high school or elementary students? Have either of you put any thought to that?
Well, Eric knows that one. I'll let Eric answer that because that's what he's
They've
working on.
interwoven some events, you know, when it comes to like the Will Brown lynching. I believe they've integrated that into the freshman social studies or part, but an overall positive and the good things that have occurred. I don't think that, well, I know that it's not part of the curriculum. You don't the Bertha Callaways is not in the curriculum. The Mildred Browns are not in the curriculum. Malcolm X may be in the curriculum, but not in the sense of his Omaha connections or anything like that, or what brought his family to Omaha and the different types of things. So uh, there definitely could be some work done on that. And it's just now it's unfortunate that the current climate, makes it to where it's some teachers are even being regulated on what they can talk about and how they talk about it. So getting it in there, there probably would have been a greater opportunity for that to happen 2 years ago uh, than right now. I think I hate to say it, but I think it's one of those situations where it can truly come up in conversations about happening maybe in another 3 years. You
By the
know,
way, by the way, Eric, I remember the conversation you had recently where you talked about this series you're going to do, and you emphatically talked about including a segment or something where young people can participate. So, in other words, you and I both know as educators that it's age appropriate in how you teach. You don't go to elementary or secondary schools and talk to them sometime on the same level. You will talk to adults on a certain level. In other words, you must decompose it, not deconstruct it, rather, not decompose. And as Malcolm was very good about make it plain, Malcolm was the kind of guy who would be speaking at the level of PhD and scholar, then he would make it plain the average person in the community could understand. So I do know you've talked about that, and maybe that's one of the things that alludes to this question is that we need to maybe integrate some of the complex and issues to younger people in the level that they can understand. Just like in elementary school, you're not going to use a secondary book unless you got some real brilliant students, which we do have a lot of those in our community that aren't always acknowledged. So again, I know that you talked about it, but I'm
I
not
want to
sure.
throw this part out, Jamal. A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with with the state of Nebraska Education Department's social studies director. She was an African American woman and very interested in building out the knowledge of young people in Nebraska around Black history. But the reality is, she's gone from that position. And I asked that I'm a professional curriculum writer for high school students. I've done quite a bit of curriculum writing now and have the ability to put this together. But this is one of those projects that shouldn't be free. And Ajmal, you've done really well at training me, and I've really heard your lesson
I didn't
that
hear
the
you
work
say it again.
you
Did you say
you
Oswald
have
didn't get
done
that free?
well at training me. I have learned this lesson. I mean, there are white curriculum writers out there who are getting paid every day to teach Black kids in Omaha and in Nebraska. And I was never in line for that job. And the reality is, and both of you know this struggle for me, I worked hard to get back to Omaha to see if I could get a job doing any kind of history work, let alone doing this education work. So, I'll throw it out there to the public right now and to you two specifically. I'm available to write some curriculum. Bring that noise. That's really fun to me. Great question just came in. Donna Polk on Facebook asked, why isn't there an effort to recognize the work of Senator Chambers? Gentlemen?
You know what? I'm not hesitating because I acknowledge and I've been around Senator Chambers for years, even as a young lad who came back from the continent, used to go down to the barber shop. But I think one of the challenges that we face is that, number one, we don't have enough folks who deal with public policy and understand the great things he's done, whether it be district elections, challenging school systems, you name it. And again, this current crop of folks don't always appreciate his contributions in Lincoln. And again, one of the things I remember him saying very well, not only publicly, but in Lincoln, is that for the record, I'm going to do this and say that. But I think that's one of the things we need to have. Matter of fact, I had a chance to read the dissertation that someone wrote about him for her PhD, and she wrote about him as a conservative who follows the rules and has been able to do everything in a certain way. It was kind of an unusual dissertation, but basically she converted it to a book, and it talked about things how he's valued in other places. And one of the things I'll throw two things out is that he was the first person in the United States to introduce legislation for disinvestment in South Africa. And I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in Botswana and traveled through South Africa. So that was a first there. And number two, one of the last meetings he was at that I'm aware of is where he was trying to talk to some young folks, and they didn't have appreciation of all the stuff he did. And so what we're going to have to do is keep reminding them that they stand on shoulders like Senator Chambers and other folks, and we need to not admonish certain people who've done stuff for us because we don't understand it. And so I agree with what Don is saying. We need to get more of that out there. But I also, Don, I want to say something real clear and be very respectful of it. We got to be careful not to go with the cult of the personality, because what I think Ernie has done is because of his parents and his community members who support him. So again, the more we bring him to the table, we use him as a metaphor, as an example, or a litany of helping us to do that kind of work. But yeah, you got a great point. And he has something named after him in the chamber. He has other things he's done. And some of us don't do a good job because there's some of those folks who don't appreciate or may dislike maybe some of his techniques. And one of the things that Eric and I have done and agreed upon, we can disagree, but at the end of the day, as we're still going forward to help our people, we're going to still sit down and not get mad about him taking that 25 cents from me when I was a young kid. We got all that stuff that happens to us in Omaha. And I think it's very important that if you're taking care, and I use the example of a family, one of the things that keep families together is the mom and the dad agreeing of the principles of what that family is about and their grandparents. So we're not a family just by ourselves. And as we say the village thing, we must acknowledge that Senator Chambers have contributed tremendous amount. But I did not know till I started reading that there were people before Ernie who was doing great things in Nebraska, and there were other elected officials again. And we just have to acknowledge all of their great ancestors and people who have done that. But I'll let other folks react to that.
Yeah, well, and in the comments, it's mentioned that Dr. Polk, she hasn't received her flowers either.
That's right.
I have materials in the museum of a book that she wrote, I believe in the 80s, about historic African Americans throughout the state of Nebraska, and that book is not a thick book, but it's a very powerful book. And I do believe, Ajmal, you had asked me if I had an extra copy of that. And it's something that I think that it's not a difficult read, but it's an educational read that I think would be great for folks to be aware of.
I have to acknowledge whenever Dr. Pope comes on, I gotta say she knew my mother and she knows me, and so she kind of holds me accountable to know that there's that expression, the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. But we need to have her come and talk about her book and how she put it together and why she did it. And again, utilize some of her expertise. In one of my recent conversations, where I know other people like to interview and talk to her, but what I love about her is her honesty and her tenacity and ability to understand some of the academic issues in our community. The other thing she's into, and I've been following her, is the medical community. We don't talk about the medical health of our community and prevention and dealing with cancer and all these other kind of issues that we should know more about from community perspective. So yeah, we need to draw down on her book and as well her expertise. And the other person who wrote a book, I think, was Alfonso Smith, who's in Black Studies. We don't talk about that. So there are some other people who've written books, and I think we need to have more community education at some of our local institutions and places and deconstruct or talk about those books and let those living authors who are around tell us how they arrive at them and what motivated them, and maybe contribute some other, as they say, grassroots folks or grass tops to do the same thing they're doing.
I would also like to say that when he was finished with his last legislative term, Senator Chambers' daughter started a campaign to start a museum in his name up by Florence Boulevard and 20 and Ames Avenue. She got a big old warehouse, an old OHA warehouse, and was going to renovate that into a whole thing. And I don't know what's happened to that proposal. The building still stands, so maybe it's still floating out there. But she did begin that campaign towards that effort. They also got the Beltline Saratoga Historical District nomination in to the National Park Service to get it made into a historical district because of that museum's role inside of that, the potential museum's role inside of that neighborhood specifically. So that's one thing that's been done to begin that honoring. I think we could support that better. But then to your point, Dr. Polk and she honored my work by sending me a copy of her book, and I've tried to cite it every single time that I can to really shine a light on it, and I can do a lot more, and I will. But the reality is, we do have to get that work out there because she does stand out as a light. Cynthia asks a really interesting thing about having the museum republish Dr. Polk's book. And I don't know if that's in your Bailey house, Eric, but I do know that we could do more. And again, it's this whole question of how do we recognize, lift up African American historians who are already doing this work. In addition to Dr. Polk, there was a great amount of work that was done at the Laurel Hills Cemetery to recognize Black soldiers who were buried there with no tombstone. And that work came from within the community. There's been a great deal of work done up at Prospect Hill, not just in the last few years, but in the long term, where the Girls Inc. really put research into these high school students conducting research on Black burials in Prospect Hill Cemetery. So some of this work is already done. And of course, the Omaha Public Schools had their great project called Making Invisible Histories Visible. And that had all kinds of work that's online still today and gets some great recognition for what it contributes to the Black history canon in Omaha. But the reality is we can do so much more to promote those pieces that already exist, in addition to that deep mining that we were talking about earlier. So Dr. Polk's work, Senator Chambers' work, as well as all these other sources, we got to keep lifting them up. I try to do that every now and then on my social media to bring out those elements on NorthOmahaHistory.com, but we could do so much more from so many different angles.
One thing I want to share, and I sometimes have to be very sensitive how I say this, but Renee Kohlberg, Dr. Kohlberg was the director of curriculum. And back in the day, I used to fight them all the time in OPS. And again, I figured out they weren't going to move. And again, my big impetus when I came from Africa was how come we don't have African books written by Africans in the curriculum? And they fought me backwards and forward. I feel like they didn't have money, but they were just being racist. But when I talked to Dr. Kohlberg, and again, the person who was my witness of that conversation, it was a heated one. And I was jamming and I was getting the best of her. She broke down and told me her dissertation was on multicultural diversity curriculum. I was shocked because I took a class with her. She wasn't the sharpest blade dealing with race issues in the class. Matthew was in that class, I think, and I was. We were throwing out the heavy light. But since she was in that position, I did not see anything of what we're talking about today by her being a superintendent of curriculum. And the other point I want to say, I think is probably very important related to that, and the Department of Education has never engaged our community on African American history and culture and so on. And they've all think I've been to North Omaha once, but the person who Ebony McKaiser is on our board, and she worked there. She came from Ohio, and then apparently they eliminated her position. So there's somebody in Lincoln who has color in their cheeks or in their buttocks or whatever that deals with our culture. So my point back to you is, until we get our systems and to understand and incorporate the things we're saying, we're paying for other people's history, and yet we've been taxation without representation. So how can the Department of Education and in these institutions, universities, have these courses and they won't bring the lay people or grassroots or elders into those classrooms? And I'm a firm believer, eliminate them. Get rid of them. We don't need them, because if they don't do anything to bring our people in their all-white supremacy departments, and again, we got governors in the last two who have made a point to eliminate diversity. I'm just saying, give us a taxation, give us back our money. Why am I paying property taxes to entities that won't recognize or hire people like us? And that's the same thing we fought back in the 1800s and the early 1900s in Nebraska.
I think
Other feedback, other reactions. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
I was just going to say that I think the most powerful thing that can happen because of what you just said, Ajamal, is to stop relying on racist systems to be anti-racist. Right? I mean, the fact of the matter is these things are what they are, and they exist the way they exist on purpose for a purpose. And it's to reinforce the power of white people over every person of color. It's to reinforce the power of rich people over poor people. It's to reinforce the power of men over women. And those systems aren't going to stop being racist, oppressive, sexist, misogynistic and classist generators of power on their own volition. They just aren't going to do it. So we have to create alternate systems. We have to create alternate realities. And I do believe that was Bertha Calloway's impetus for creating the Black History Museum, the Great Plains Black History Museum. It was to step into the space that white people refuse to occupy because of our racist systems that we rely on to maintain power over Black people and all people of color.
Right.
So creating alternate institutions is the vital way to go.
As you said to that, and again, I would allude to my experience working at Douglas County dealing with racial ethnic disparities. After I was there for a few years, they finally figured out that I was going to bend down and kiss her ring finger or whatever. But again, they were never serious about addressing the disparities in the criminal justice systems or in the juvenile justice system and so on. So again, I guess it begs to the conversation, or the point was just made. We have to work on alternative systems because at the end of the day, many of these entities are, again, Trumpites or supporters of this segregation apartheid, where, again, as Malcolm talks about, they put the knife in your back, pull it out for a few inches and call it progress. Well, no, that's not progress when you look at the numbers. So if you look at that dropout rates, if you look at the juvenile justice system, you look at the criminal justice system, you look at the legal system, you look at all of them, they, for the most part, excluded our folks. And again, it all starts with the school to prison pipeline. And we have to, if we don't control our destiny, then we're forced to, as they say, eat the garbage of our somewhat comrades. And we got to, again, speak truth to justice and be like those folks who've come before us and make sure we call it, name it, and claim it. As we say, speak truth to power.
That's right. Here in the comments, Cynthia just dropped another one. She said, Adam, please comment on the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act and the slaveholders' actions, quote, following the law, and anti-enslavement activists, quote, breaking the law by heroic efforts to free the enslaved. Online, both the 1850 Act and the early 1793 Act were officially repealed by Congress in 1864. All right, so let's just contextualize this. For Nebraska's sake, the state of Nebraska didn't exist before 1867. Before that point, it was the territory of Nebraska. Before that point, it was Indian territory. And before that point, it was Spain. In that order. France was somewhere in there, but you get the idea. The reality is, starting in 1805, when Lewis and Clark came through Nebraska, they brought an African-American enslaved man with them. A black man. He was called York, and he was the first African-American on record as being in Nebraska. So the first black in Nebraska was an enslaved person. In the 1850s, by then, there were already enslaved people throughout the entire present-day state of Nebraska. The U.S. military allowed their officers to have enslaved people with them as their property, the same way that they were allowed to have a horse and a trunk and whatever else they owned. And so from that place, there were already enslaved black people in Nebraska in 1850 when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Now, a wonderful new book just came out by a woman named Gail Schaefer Blackenow, and the book is called Journey to Freedom, Uncovering the Grayson Sisters' Escape from Nebraska Territory. And it's the story of two young women who escaped enslavement from Nebraska City before 1862. They ran to Chicago. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed the enslaver, who, by the way, was a man whose last name was Knuckles, Nuckolls, to chase after them. And he went to Chicago and he brought fugitive slave hunters with him. And they went chasing these two formerly enslaved women, these freedom seekers. They disappeared into the crowd. There was a gigantic profile and all kinds of things happened. And it's a beautiful book that tells that story. However, the important thing to know is that happened from Nebraska. Nebraska is not innocent of enslavement. It did not have slaves. And as a matter of fact, where most Nebraska history books say that there were only 10 enslaved people when it became a territory in 1856, there were actually at least 50 enslaved people in Nebraska at that point. I have names and dates and owners for every one of them. So this is fact that this history has been repressed. And Cynthia, your question is great because it brings out the reality. There were enslaved people in Nebraska. They did escape, and many of them escaped freedom. Many were killed and sold out of the state, out of the territory, and enslavement was hard fought against in Nebraska, but it was also hard fought for in Nebraska because the state has always struggled with racial justice. Eric?
Wow.
Yeah, I was going to say also, even though we came into the Union as a free state, in our state constitution, there is information regarding enslavement, and it
That's
wasn't removed from our Constitution until 2020. And even though it was removed, 30% of Nebraska voters voted to keep it as part of our Constitution. And we're
And
talking
that's
in
reality.
2020. Yes.
Facts.
If I didn't know y'all both, I would think y'all made that crap up. That doesn't even make sense in 2020, the
Hey,
20th
y'all might check out a book that has all that information and a lot more. It's called Roots of Justice, and there's a chapter on the history of African Americans in Nebraska that details all of that and a lot more.
By the way, one of the things I almost found ironic, and I think it's part of the same conversation, is that I know Justin Wing was the one who introduced the legislation he talked about. I'm like, why is he raising something like that up in this day and age? Are there people still archaic or backwards or just stupid or asinine or just racist or evil or whatever? And then Eric, you just alluded to, we got some knuckleheads and some neo-Nazis running around in key positions in business suits and pumps. And again, I know a lot of these institutions I've worked with, they got a bunch of daughters of the Confederates. And again, you can tell the way they talk, where they protect their systems. But yeah, we got to call them out and expose them. And again, pull back the sheets and show that they're butt naked trying to do the same stuff they did way back in the day. Folks, we're down to the last 10 minutes. And before we start to wind down, I want to make sure if there's some other questions or comments from our participants if they want to share, because again, as we say what you need to say or forever hold your peace. So other feedback from other folks before we wind down. And then obviously we want the participants to have some guests and also want to have closing comments. But other feedback from folks. Journey to Freedom. Okay.
Here, I've got it. I'm having a hard time posting the title.
And
I'll
by
grab
the
it.
way, it's on the website. I was surprised that it's also they have it on the website. And I want to give a shout out to Nebraska Peace, obviously, and the NAACP in Lincoln as this one of their joint products that they turned out. I'm very impressed that they pulled that off. And Eric, I'm always nervous when these people in Lincoln outdo us because we got this interstate rivalry. We don't want somebody in Scottsbluff or Verdigris or Bankman or whatever, Shadron to outdo us. So I want us to put out something like that too at some point related to our culture and our history and so on. But yeah, it's also on the website, and so there's more information you can get about getting a hard copy of it. And I do know they have electronic copies of this wonderful document out there. I haven't fully read it, but I do know we're going to do some book discussions and working in collaboration with other people on why we need to talk about racism, history, and our historical rich history of Nebraska and people of color. Folks, we're down to about 7 minutes, but before we do that, I want to throw one last questions back to both of us, and again, or to those of us participating. Eric, you did something this past year, which is a first, where you've done this series and so on and everything. You just alluded to what you can do in the coming year. But from your vantage point, what was one of the things that stood out to you in those events that you participated? I know that you were not at all of them because you had other commitments, but what jumped out at you that made you most proud of what you've done in the past year? And you also may allude to something that you've done within the Great Plains Black History Museum that we haven't done. You and I talked about doing an interview one day, but we've never done it. But this is our first encounter. But throw something out to me in the past year that you've been most proud of in 2025.
Well, when it comes to Black Heritage Saturday, just starting this up again and making it available to the community. But if you look at it, what I'm happy about the most is, in 2025 we had our highest, overall guest interaction that we've ever had, which we've had over 13,000, believe 13,400. Which is for a facility of our size is significant. And so to me, that's the one thing that I'm most proud of is the fact that how many people we've been able to be of service to.
And going the same question to you, Adam, what were you most proud about 2025?
Uh,
I know,
well, the
I
book,
know. I call the audible like they do in Kansas City. The middle
you're
Holmes
good.
is at the line. He's getting ready to score a
You're
touchdown.
good.
He throw it all at you, switch up on you, and it just shows you know your stuff. Okay, I don't want to embarrass you, but then I
You're
might.
good. No, no,
Okay.
no, no, no. Here we go. Here we go. It's a funny thing. I don't look at a lot of this as accomplishments. This is just an ongoing uphill struggle. But I mean to embrace what I've done as well. The Roots of Justice book, um, It actually was a 3-year project that took a long time to get out the gates. They had a lot of editing to do. They had a lot of process to get through in order to put that out. And so to see that actually come out this year was a really big deal for me. I mean, it's beautiful. I have a lot of good feelings about that book and what it's doing. One of the things that I want to point out real quick, Jamal, I also earlier in the chat I dropped a link to my history on I'm sorry, it's an article on the history of African Americans in Grand Island. I'll repost the link right here. But what I'm doing next, so I did the book. I did a tour of Nebraska with Preston Love Jr. when he was running for Senate, and I got to meet and interact with a lot of these cities. And basically, what I'm going to do is an individual article on every major city in Nebraska, highlighting its Black history specifically. So Hastings is on deck. Grand Island was first just because it popped up. But the point is that I'm going to be equally as excited this next year to really highlight these different statewide kind of elements. But then the other part is to really highlight rural communities, because the fact of the matter is, we talk about exodusters and we talk about those. We have Nicodemus as the most popular exoduster community in Kansas, in the Great Plains, even. But the reality is, and we brought out the story of DeWitty in the last several years, and really the descendants of DeWitty have done tremendous work to show that African Americans have this rural history in Nebraska. I've got a half dozen towns across the state that Black people founded. And those stories haven't been told or shared. And they're mentioned a little bit in the Roots of Justice, but I'm going to bring out a big old flashlight and shine it all over it and just really, really paint out the state so that the whole thing can attach to this Black history, that it's not just an Omaha, Lincoln, Hastings, Grand Island kind of thing, but it's actually everybody everywhere all the time. And it wasn't just hate-filled, racist, hood-wearing white people who hated Black people, but it was a lot of white people, if not almost all of us.
Right.
Because the fact of the matter is, this is systemic. This is ground in, and
Right.
I'm just going to shine that light.
Folks, we're at the very end, and I want to kind of close out by saying thank you, both of y'all, for participating as we had approached this from a different kind of tepid point of view and how we were going to do it and lay it out, but it turned out to be very good. But one of the things that happens when you're the host and you throw out a question, you also want to answer the question for yourself. We did some table talk years ago, and I was a facilitator, and one of the guys said, Ashma, I want to know what you think. And so I want to answer that question. But one of the highlights for us is more and what we've done is we've helped notch this conversation up to a higher level in our community. I also was surprised and impressed that we got funding from the State Historical Society again. This was our second year we did that event related to Black history and so on. We also got funding from the Great Plains Black Museum, Inclusive Community, the library. Omaha Public Library supported us, as well as the African American Commission. So again, these are entities that when you're sometimes cross hairs with them or you're doing this, they still can turn around and support the important work that you do. So I'm very grateful for what they've done. But what I've learned the most, and I think it's probably the great highlight, is that we can come together, we can disagree, and we can advance forward our communities. But I think the most important thing we got to do is measure it. We need to do the satisfaction surveys, make sure that the folks are graduating, that they're getting the outcomes from these institutions. And so that's been one of the things where we can hold people's feet to the fire, accountable, and all the other good things we talk about, transparencies and so on, as we face trying times. And again, trying times require people to do some different things as we're facing today. And so we need all hands on deck, folks, and we can't allow the few to do the work for the many. And so I close out by saying I really appreciate what you've contributed today, but also I know that we got to admonish and challenge those folks who are standing on the sidelines as bystanders or victims, and we must push back at the perpetrators, as Roald Hindenburg writes about in the Jewish Holocaust. Again, the Holocaust that happened in Nazi Germany, also Holocaust happened in the United States with Africans and Native Americans and Rwanda and Bosnia and so on. So let's not act like one group has a corner on committing or experiencing the Holocaust, but the Holocaust can exist in our individual lives when somebody's died prematurely because of lack of health care or basic services and so on. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you both for being a part of this. And again, hopefully we can do some other events related to bringing some heavy light and throw out some pearls of wisdom. Eric, did you want to say something? I saw you raise your hand there.
Yeah, I was going to say we just have to make sure folks understand it's not a Black issue, it's an our issue, which means all of us.
Gotcha.
Because what happens to us today can happen to you tomorrow.
Well, I appreciate it, and I think that's a wonderful note to close on, as we always end our programs by saying, may the force be with you. Baroko.